It's our custom at our meetings and our workshops to say the Pledge of Allegiance. So would you join us in the Pledge of Allegiance? I
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And the Council Commission will turn on your microphones, please. Kristen, is that you?
No, I just turned mine off because of it. Clearly it's one of us.
I'm not going to name names, Kristen, that one.
Might be your mic.
It's still doing it. I
think
think
so?
yours, they're all too close together.
Yeah, because you're closest.
Should I pull mine over here?
Oh, that's not helping.
Or should I just turn it off?
Turn it off.
All right, then, Jason, you turn yours back on. Just stay quiet.
Yeah, because they're too close.
No,
Good.
I tried turning this one back on, I turned it back off. We'll just use that one.
How's that?
we'll give it a try.
I can speak up enough.
Everybody speak louder. So we've got a couple of things to cover tonight. I'm going to ask our planner, Liz Stockman, to get us started off. And then Liz is going to give some background. We have representatives from the Met Council here tonight to share with us, Lisa and Eric. And so we'll introduce them at the appropriate time. And Liz will ask you then to guide us, and then when it's appropriate to ask questions, we can open it up for some additional questions.
Okay, sure.
Like anyone's view, so I'll just sit down, I think. Okay, so, the goal tonight is to move forward in the planning process for our 2040 land use plan. And part of that is having a discussion about the designations that are issued by Met Council, and in now then, those are rural residential and diversified rural. So, just a little bit of history, obviously, oh sure, now it's cut off. This is the 2020 comprehensive plan composite, metro-wide land use, basically, when now then was still permanent rural. So that was almost 20 years ago. And then this was our 2030 plan that's currently in place, showing the MUSA line, which is the dark black line surrounding the gray diversified rural. The MUSA has been removed for the 2040 plan. The diversified rural and the rural residential, which is the remainder of the city, are currently in place at the recommended designations by Met Council. So this is a little more detailed description of the designations and shows the relationship to other communities in Anoka County and the adjacent cities of Oak Grove and Ramsey, as well as St. Francis. So again, most of Now Then and most of Oak Grove are rural residential, and the diversified rural in Now Then abuts the Oak Grove border. To our south is Ramsey, all emerging suburban edge. And St. Francis has its own rural center and is somewhat insignificant as far as land use planning at this time. One interesting thing that I noted was that back in around 2008, when the current comp plan was approved, the population estimates were projected at 5,800 people for 2030. But in this planning cycle, even though it's 10 years later, they've dropped that projection to 5,100. So hence, the removal of the MUSA and the admittance by Met Council and Ramsey that the sewer service is not going to reach now then within the 2040 time frame. Another detailed view of those land uses. We'll talk a little bit about Oak Grove's diversified rural, and the process, legislative process, that they proceeded through to have that removed and what impacts that may have on their city as well as surrounding areas. This is a map of Ramsey showing their sewer service areas and just showing that the interceptors and the sewer services are still in the southeast portion of the city and not anywhere near the Nowland border at this time. This is Nowland's existing land use map and just shows currently through this year the land uses as the properties are used at the present time. And that is a good planning tool. You can see all in the light yellow are the properties that contain residences, and the green would be all agriculturally used or properties without a residence. And then small areas of commercial and industrial, of course, in our two focus areas along the main thoroughfares. Just for comparison, and if we need to refer to it, I threw in Oak Grove's land use map along our border here. Very similar in nature to our land uses. Larger lots, some remaining agriculture, and basically kind of interdispersed, spread out among the city's various subdivisions. So just a couple other comments. Generally, we've had discussions among the council regarding the diversified rural, and there is not necessarily a ton of favoritism for that designation, just because it does limit the landowner's ability to subdivide and develop. With that 1/10 density, it does tend to make it difficult and puts limitations on these landowners, their ability to sell and or develop. So we did have a discussion at the work session last Thursday about how in the diversified rural, the Met Council favors either 10 acres and greater for lot sizes, or lot sizes that are smaller, possibly on shared systems, that could accommodate future public sewer and water. So what is frowned upon is sort of the mid-range lot sizes of 5 acres and 2.5 acres, without any flexibility to accommodate future public services. So we can certainly discuss that more and have them answer some questions for us specifically. There are ways, as they will discuss, ways to allow a 2.5 or a 5 acre lot if flexible development options are used to allow allow the 2.5 or the 5 acres now with the ability to split later and accommodate services if, should they become available. Another question that was brought up at the work session last week was regarding Oak Grove's history and how the development patterns kind of took place there and how they ended up at that 2.5 acre size. So we would ask Met Council to answer that question for us. They have a draft copy of their comprehensive plan out. Currently, there's some council members that have looked at it and have noted some inconsistencies with the 1 per 10 density versus 2.5, 4 per 10. Met Council wanted you to be aware that they have not reviewed that comp plan yet, and they may, have comments on that and request changes from Oak Grove. That's yet to be determined. Another question that now then has is in light of the recent changes in the bill that was passed regarding diversified rural in Oak Grove, how does that affect the future of Oak Grove, and are there or could there be any repercussions from that action? So, I mean, now then in Oak Grove, we're on the very northern edge of the metro area, within Met Council's jurisdiction. How are they viewing that urban sprawl as it creeps farther and farther north? And, will Oak Grove, for instance, be forced into some possible suburban or urban-sized lots, later, even, despite what the current action has been? So there are a lot of questions out there. Nowlin and Oak Grove tend to compare themselves to one another. One final question I'll mention, and then I'll give the floor to
Just a
Council.
correction there on this thing. They don't compare themselves to us ever.
All right.
I know for a fact.
That's some inside information.
Yeah.
All right, I stand corrected. One final question is regarding the pending annexation hearing for land along our border. And if that land were annexed into Oak Grove, does the Met Council assume that it just automatically becomes part of the rural residential with the 2.5 acre lot size? And or does, do you have any input? Obviously, they would have to go through another comp plan amendment or add that area to their planning boundaries. So just a few things that were floating around in our heads here. So with that, I'd like to introduce Lisa Barajas and Eric Barajas from Met Council. And they graciously came over to answer these questions and to help us through some of this planning. So, thank you.
We will have Eric just kind of start with an overview, and then we'll go into your questions. And hopefully we're catching everything, so please do forgive us if we don't kind of interrupt, ask questions. We're not intending to miss anything at all.
Thanks, Lynn. That's a really good introduction. And thanks for having us out once again. It's a beautiful evening. We were saying it'd be nice if we could meet outside. But
We can, we got a nice park right over there.
yeah. I was trying to remember the last time I was here. I think it was it in winter time, or was it even before that?
I think it was January.
January? Yeah. And it was just myself at that point, and I think when I heard that the conversation had been evolving, I thought it was really important to have Lisa come along, because she might be able to help with some of those broader questions that the city might have.
Sure.
But before I kind of launch into I've got a few slides here. A lot of it's material that you've probably seen before or will be aware of, but I kind of wanted to get a sense of from you. I think that, are you all city council, or I know I recognize some of you as city council.
Everybody's city council raised their hand. So we've got 4 council members
Okay.
here.
And the rest are commissioners?
Commissioners, we have our city attorney, Bob Rupi,
Great, okay.
and then our planner is the rest are commissioners.
Great, okay. So, one thing that would be nice to know, just to get an idea of context, is, you know, how that conversation has been going since the last 2 times we've been here, and, you know, it sounds, I mean, this is kind of giving an overview of what the city's maybe thinking, but does anybody want to just volunteer kind of a synopsis of, or a summary of what the city is thinking in terms of their future vision and how the city kind of wants to see itself develop over the next 20 years or so? How those conversations are going?
I will take a stab at it. And certainly council members feel free to correct me where I've wandered off, but the majority of residents moved out here to enjoy the rural atmosphere. At this point, the majority like the larger lot sizes. We have to decide what that looks like as our population gets older and the areas around us develop. And so one of the things we're very, as Liz brought up, we have a lot of questions on what's happening in Oak Grove, because that's really one of the last areas that's undeveloped around us. Ramsey has got a portion on their north edge that's still fairly protected on our south edge. Elk River is pushing in on our western border. And St. Francis has the mix with the rural center and then the farmland around that. So on our northern edge, it's going to be very much farmland adjoining where it abuts St. Francis. The big difference is the commonality and what's happening in Oak Grove that would put pressure on us. And part of that is the detachment and annexation. That is specifically to go from our larger lots to their 2.5. And so that's really the big difference between our communities. So their development will directly impact the pressures we see. And Ramsey's, we're going to be protected on the south for a little bit as they grow north, but that pressure will come. Elk River has very small lots, city lots with sewer and water coming in on our western edge. So the community itself wants to have the autonomy and the ability to continue with the 5 acres if you were to poll the majority communities. Now within that, our zoning does allow in developments to average 5 acres. So there will be smaller lots than that, there will be larger lots. As Liz mentioned, some of the options there in working with the Met Council, we haven't discussed fully. Because right now, our preference would be to just be now then and not worry about the outside world. Many residents, when I visit with them, are asking when the gates go up, because they're here now and we can close the gates behind them because we don't really need anybody else out here. That's not practical, and it's not going to happen. But currently, without sewer water, without any sewer and water in the foreseeable future, we're also not likely to see the pressure from the larger developers and builders coming out here. It's going to continue to be 40 acres here and 40 acres there, 10 acres here. A couple of our recent developments, we had 92 acres just sold, 2 people bought it and divided it between them. And I don't see that going smaller than that any time in the future. We have, I think, 4 proposals coming up to our next planning and zoning meeting that could be broken up into 5 acres. But right now, the consensus that I hear and the consensus I've heard from the council is we'd like to stay as rural as we can as long as we can. We're proud that we still have the last 2 dairy farms in Anoka County. We have a lot of cattle and some buffalo and some llama and a lot of horses. So there's a real demand that's disappearing in Anoka County for places where you can have the large animals. So that's still an attraction to our community. And we, you know, looking at the numbers that Liz showed up there, the majority of people are going to still work outside the city. We're going to be a bedroom community with large lots to have large animals. So that would be a short summary. Anybody else from the council want to? All right, so that's, rural is what people moved out here for.
That's really helpful, and I think it kind of reflects what I heard last time when I was here. Okay, you know, what I would expect now then to want, but I also understand, based on what you're saying, that you, forward thinking, you recognize that there's obviously development occurring around you. But certainly wanting to stay rural is something that I would expect from now on in terms of the development pattern that exists here and what you've been hearing from probably all the residents and the council. So that makes sense. One thing that I want to emphasize when we talk about this this diversified rural area. And I feel like we get kind of hung up on some of the language around it, but really what we're wanting, or what the policy is saying around diversified rural is that places like Nowden, you know, it's actually, from a council perspective and a policy perspective, it's actually better if Nowden stays rural, as rural really as possible. I mean, you're kind of talking about preserving agricultural land and natural resources. That's something that we would certainly support. And part of the reason for our support of that is obviously it's good from a tax perspective, because when we are at the point when the city is wanting that infrastructure to come to it, maybe it's 34 years down the line, but at that point, then it's going to be more economically viable to connect and subdivide if the city's wanting that. Now, develop in different development patterns other than diversified rural can make that really less cost effective in the future and almost impossible for any sort of sewer infrastructure to come up, and it affects the financial viability of those connections. So from our perspective, I just want to be absolutely clear that if Nowden wants to stay rural, that's something that we would certainly support. And the diversified rural community designation is one way of doing that. Now, we're not necessarily saying that you would have to, or you could develop with 4 units per 40 acres all across the diversified rural area. There's different ways of administering that, where you can allow for different densities. And we've kind of talked about that with Liz a little bit. But we'd be happy to provide those examples. One thing...
Eric, if I could
Yeah.
just, as you're discussing this, one of the things that we do need to recognize too is that because this has been family farms for so long, and some of those people are not continuing in that, this is their retirement.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been their bank account. That land is their bank account. And when you start talking about diversified rural of 10-acre minimums, that affects their retirement plans significantly. So the creativity, I know that's been one of the hangups in the MUSA area, was those people that felt like if they were to develop, they could only develop down into 10-acre parcels, or come up with something creative in a cluster type development that facilitated future sewer. But it's going to be long past their lifetime, maybe past when their kids would benefit from it. So that's one of the things that we need to be aware of, sensitive to. But a lot of these people out here have lived here, if not all of their lives, most of their lives, and their large parcels were their retirement plan. And so anytime we affect their ability to sell that land at a good profit for the retirement, that's when it's going to get very uncomfortable for everybody. So we need to make sure we understand what a 1 in 10 does to the people that have been here a long time.
Eric, I got a few questions. Oak Grove right now, what I've been told, their existing lot sizes are 2.5 acres across the city. And Oak Grove's philosophy is they don't ever want to see your sewer. They don't want it. And from what I've heard, as of now, Met Council's saying Musa won't be out here 24, if ever. What happens if Nowden says, we don't want your sewer? We feel the same as Oak Grove. We don't want your sewer, and we want to treat everybody the same across the city. They can all have the exact same development rate. Why should certain areas only be, 10-acre lots to be treated differently? I don't think that's right. And I think a lot of people out there don't want your sewer. They don't want city water. That takes away the rural atmosphere. And why can't we move forward with that view? And that's the same view that Oak Grove has, and it sounds, from what I've been told, that's their city across the board is 2.5 acres. Everybody's treated the same.
If I could give Erica a hand here. We haven't, like Liz had mentioned earlier, we haven't seen Oak Grove's new plan yet. Their current plan does not have the same guidance for me. Some folks are agricultural, some folks are 2.5 acres. That they do have some variety in there, wanting to recognize, in the past at least, recognizing that some folks are in longer term, and obviously like you folks also have industrial areas as well, limited, scattered throughout. What we have seen in, as our responsibility in the region is to be managing the growth of our region and ensuring that not only that we're using the infrastructure investments that we've made as the public and put into those things, but also ensuring that we're not creating new demand for infrastructure in rural areas that's premature. So it's part of the reason the council has taken this approach of development being where infrastructure exists and really limiting rural development outside of that. And in parts of the region, Mr. Mayor, to your point about agricultural purposes, I hear that loud and clear, and when I was a local city planner in rural Minnesota, that was a common theme in our conversations. Those were things that we were regularly very cognizant of. And one of the experiences that we as staff had brought to this conversation around our land use policy is really trying to build into our rural policies different flexibilities that allow for communities to think about ways that you can accommodate that demand today, that in areas where we are planning for sewer, don't preclude future sewer service. In areas where we're not planning for sewer, don't create a development pattern that might be unsustainable on septic. There are places across our region that don't have the best soils for long-term septic sustainability, and so we don't want to see failures and then local septic failures happen and then have that request to come to the region to help fix that. We've experienced that in other parts of the region, and that's never a fun place to be in. We have local property owners that can't afford to upgrade their septic on their own. The cost of extending services is also costly. So there's a lot then that we take on as a region to subsidize that, because we don't want to have public health issues on local properties. So what we are asking of communities when they're thinking about a different development pattern that isn't a 4x40 with flexibility, that's an individual lot on sewers, on private sector, is that you're being mindful about the other kind of environmental constraints on your landscape that might limit the ability for that to continue to be privately served in the long term. So we want to be sure that, let's say you have, and this is certainly the case, especially across portions of Norfolk County, you have a lot of wetlands in this area. You do have sandy soils, but you also have high water tables. So we really want you to be taking into consideration those constraints that can limit the long-term viability of septic systems, and be very mindful about where you're allowing developments, so that we don't get into a situation where we're trying to figure out how to fix a problem after the fact. That's really what we're asking communities to be doing where we're not planning for long-term sewer service. We don't want to then 10, 20 years down the road have to come back and try to address an issue that now is becoming, that might be more economically costly because of a development pattern that has already been put in place, and fewer people who might use that urban service to fix a septic issue. That was kind of the genesis of the council's formation in the early 70s, was really to fix the sewer issue across the region, and most of those were about municipal plants that were not well managed, but there were also a number of septics across the region that also were kind of pulled up into that because they were also failing and were lacking good alternatives for on-site secondary backups that could also continue to serve that purpose. So those are the things that we'd really like you to keep in mind as you're thinking about the different options for development, and thinking about where that is best suited in your community that can be maintained in the long term in a rural pattern like that.
So Lisa, then if we were to somehow show, and I see the strengths in our ordinance, and there are a couple spots where I see the weaknesses, but if we were to show and include, be sure to include all these, for instance, we require 1.5 acres of upland, we call that our buildability. We do currently allow wetlands to be counted as part of the 5 acres. We could, set up something where you have a net gross and it can only be X amount of your lot. We have some older lots that are very difficult to build on for that reason. But I know the county in general has a very good management program with the pumping every 3 years and, that kind of thing.
Right.
And we certainly follow state law with, the primary site and the backup site. So I'm just saying, so is there a way then to, if we document all that and get all those things in place, that we can kind of go on like we are?
Right. Your current guidance that's in your 2030 plan was already authorized by the council. Maintaining your current guidance moving forward in all of your rural residential areas is completely where you can go, and carrying that forward into what is right now designated diversified rural, we'd have to look at it a little closer. But if you were talking about that type of kind of long-term sustainability, balancing that with that protection of wetlands within the area, that those would generally be consistent with the council policies. We'd have to look a little closer in detail and be happy to work with you on kind of getting you in that direction. But really, that's the long-term goal that the council is really seeking in rural areas without long-term sewer service.
But going back to the question that was initially presented, it seems like everything you just told me seems to be completely opposite of the policies that were initiated for Oak Grove, where they have a majority of the land as 2.5 acres, which seems to run counter to the policies that you were just elaborating on. Can you explain that?
Yeah. Across the region, we actually recently put some history on this. There are pockets of development around the region that occurred at lot sizes are smaller than 5 acres in size. A lot of those existing development patterns, the bulk of those subdivisions occurred prior to 1970. There was a peak kind of during the 70s, was right around when the Land Planning Act was being passed, which was in 1976. That was the council's organization around comprehensive planning and regional planning. And the conversation at that time really was, what do we do with 2-acre lots in the metro? That was, when we were looking back at all the historical documents, and those conversations, that was one of the largest issues that the region was discussing at that time, was how do we handle that when these are outside areas that are not being provided with sewer service? Because that was what was the major development trend since then. Of course, that has dropped off quite a bit. It doesn't mean it's gone away completely. Development has continued to occur. And in the case of Oak Grove, there were, and I'm going to speak generally because I don't remember exact details off the top of my head, so don't quote dates or times or anything, but very generally that over the course of, particularly in the 90s, when there was starting an uptrend in development after a recession in the 80s, that Oak Grove had requested to amend their plan several times to turn to support 2.5-acre lot developments in various places around their community. And I don't know what they were guiding, what they were changing, but that was the intent of those amendments. And the council's review authority around amendments to plans is related to consistency with council policies and conformance to regional systems. And at that time, many of the amendments that were proposed were pretty small in nature, less than 40 acres in size and smaller, 10 lots here, 5 lots there, were incremental. But the council had given, kind of advised the city along the way that should this trend continue, that it may amount to something that would eventually impact the regional system for wastewater services. That it would start to get to the point where that there was so much development occurring here that it was not ever going to be economically feasible to provide service here. And resulting at a point in the 90s where there was a development proposed for Southeast Oak Grove that was large in nature. I think it was around the Swan Lake area. And forgive me for a minute, lack of details off the top of my head. Metropolitan Council did ultimately say no and called that a conformance issue and required the city to change their plan, that Oak Grove could not do that because they didn't have sewer service and they are proposing a level of development in a highly sensitive natural resource area that the council did not find to be sustainable in any way, that would ultimately request urban services in order to support in the long term. And we weren't planning for services in that area at that time. And so that's the path that got us to the point of considering, as we moved into the 2000s, of development requests in East Bethel. And at that time, as many of you recall, in the early 2000s, there was a lot of development happening in this region all over the place, from urban to suburban and rural areas as well. And so that's why the council was considering that wastewater facility that's now in East Bethel was really as a way to capture growth and development and ensure that it could be sustained in the long term without having any public health impacts because of the potential for septic failure. And some, what are in the region are pretty, not the best soils for septic. And in that conversation of planning for and developing the plans for the East Bethel plant, conversations with Oak Grove included reserving that land in the southeast portion of their community to provide sewer service. They already had development demand there in the past. They had other property owners indicate that they were interested in that, and it also was a highly sensitive natural area that had presented a lot of environmental constraints for development. So development on septic. And so, and that's how we got to that agreement. The city and the council agreed at that time, I think it was about the mid-2000s, to reserve that land to be provided for urban services at some point in the future. And while we had provided it for post-2040 or post-2030 in our last plan, the council had always is willing to entertain requests for earlier entry into that system, should development pressures and demand change over time. So we had kind of that series of both a historical development pattern that existed, plus these additional incremental changes over time that eventually added up to something that really pushed the region to consider a different approach to managing rural development in this portion of the region. And in other portions of the region for that matter as well. We had seen also development patterns and a lot of development pressure in Northwest Hennepin County and in Washington County as well. Washington County as a whole decided to pass a local county conservation tax, which they used to preserve their highest valued natural resource areas through easements and acquisitions, so they developed around that. That's been their pattern in rural areas. Dakota, Scott, and Carver, for the most part, have been largely agricultural and have seen a little less of that pressure than we've seen in that Northwest kind of arc across in the rural areas. Did I get to all of that? So I'm going to make sure
Well,
I
it
answered
just-
your question.
It's kind of a broad overview of the
Right.
whole geographic area of the state here. But I guess the real question goes back to Oak Grove, where, and again, I haven't been a part of all these earlier meetings, but it appears that a great majority of Oak Grove was allowed to develop with Met Council's blessing at 2.5 acres. And yet, it appears that that same consideration you're telling us in your presentation here is not something that you would consider or favor for the city of Malden. And that puts us, the residents, at a limitation for developing in the future. It also puts us at risk for future annexation and detachment requests from people that want to go then and expand into other areas with, clearly, people vote with their pocketbooks.
Sure.
And if you can develop at 2.5 acres rather than 10 acres, well, there's
Sure.
quite a bit more economic viability there.
Mhm.
So what is the council's position
Sure.
with that? Would they treat the city of Malden and give us that same consideration?
So what I will note is that when those amendments to Oak Grove's plan were occurring was actually 2 or 3 administrations of the council ago. So different officials at that time under different policies. And like any government body, as your officials change, you have different directions on where you'd like to go. And there are things that this council has, and even our previous council under the Pawlenty administration, did not support 2.5 acre lots. Now there are limitations, and like I had noted, in the first several amendments that had come through from Oak Grove, about 3 or 4 administrations ago now in the 90s, that the council's ability to say no to some of those changes are limited to its relationship to impacts to our regional system. An incremental change is unlikely to have an impact to our regional system. There's some legalese that goes around with that, but its statute is limited to that being a substantial departure from or substantial impact on the regional system. After several of those had come in from Oak Grove, and this is where I had noted, and why I wanted to give you that history, is that the council noted these increments over time were substantial enough in character to represent an impact to the regional system. That we were going to be seeing the potential for a request to be coming to the region to provide sewer services in this area that we were not planning for providing. So while we may have approved them, we certainly did not give our blessing to them. I want to be very clear about that. The council doesn't have the ability to approve, or we can only require you to change. We don't get to approve or deny like we do on local planning permit applications. It's a little bit of a nuanced role that the legislature has given the council. So,
Just to be clear, Lisa,
Mhm.
we're not seeking your blessing, but
Right.
approval would be fine.
In writing?
Right, but I just want to be clear on that there are times when, if there's not an impact to our system, we can't deny an application. It's a little bit more of a constrained authority that the council has in that constraint. But I would like to say though is that our last administration, the Pawlenty administration, our current administration, have very much wanted to provide that flexibility, that you're not limited to a 10-acre lot, that you have some flexibility in different development patterns to consider. And the reason that the council does not like or promote a 2.5-acre lot is because it splits up the landscape in such a way, when not well done, that if things do go wrong, if you do need to have urban services, it becomes very costly. And we don't want to get ourselves into that situation. So what we're really looking for from communities is to be very clear about when you're going to be providing or allowing for higher densities, where that's going to be and under what conditions it's allowable, so it can be sustainable in the long term, so that you won't have to come and request future urban services because you don't expect this to work. So we recognize that there is both the agricultural demand, that folks are retiring, we know that's out there, and we also recognize that there are folks who just want to live, they just want to live in Allen, and they would like to have that opportunity to live here as well. I entirely get that. So we wanted to provide that flexibility. We have some examples of how you can do that, but we're also open to considering other examples that kind of meet those high-level principles as well. Of really working with your city staff. We have our engineers that look at soils and other things too, just to make sure that, yeah, in this area that makes a lot of sense, or that type of pattern makes sense in this area too. Really making sure that you can kind of accommodate that short-term demand, and also set yourselves up for maintaining that rural atmosphere for as long as you can, and also not kind of having property owners find themselves in a bit of a pinch if something goes wrong in 10 years or 15 years and they don't have room for backup. We really want to prevent that issue from happening as well.
We require all lots to have a backup.
Absolutely.
And with today's sewer standards, they're a lot different than what they were even 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Especially 20, 30, 40 years ago. The sewers typically are not gonna fail today. They'd really have to abuse it or misuse it.
Right.
And then there's still, even if they didn't have a backup location, you can do, there's a special name for it, but basically you dig that system out, and you can put a new system right on top of where the existing one was. So,
Right.
so the need for your future MUSA line, I think is mute. You know, like I said, the people out here don't want it. And you guys have said you don't see it coming by 2040, if ever.
And
And
Mr.
the
Mayor,
people out here
that's-
don't like the PUDs. Basically, that's what the alternatives, there's like PUDs, you have some smaller lots, and then you save larger lots to be developed at a later date.
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Commissioner, I'm sorry.
Council member.
Councilmember, there are a lot of different ways of approaching it. It does not have to be PUD. There's lots of different ways of approaching different flexible development options. Some of what Liz was referring to that's already on your books is one way. And you're right, our SSTS rules, the septic rules, are a lot stronger than they used to be. Recent rules have made it up to date. We are only asking that you consider other environmental constraints. Lot size alone doesn't always solve that. There are other, obviously, presence of wetlands and some of the things that Liz was mentioning, or other constraints that can limit that backup gate places. So some of those things you're already doing, those are the things that we encourage you to continue doing.
So, and certainly you said our 2030 plan, if we were to continue on that, and that's the bulk of what we've got is, we like the 2030 plan, we want to continue down that road. The concern I have is the pressure that developers will bring for those smaller lots. And in particular, we keep bringing up Oak Grove because we've been through the ringer on that lately. When the southeast corner of their city, their MUSA, was released from the Met Council plans, that's a big deal up here. And our annexation detachment issue has everything to do with that. Really, the only distinction between us and Oak Grove is the lot size. And at 500 acres, you can double your housing on that lot size. It's, you know, where do we stop moving the border? Because people up and down the line say, well, I can do 2.5 next door. And so when we sat with Oak Grove, when they decided to support this detachment and annexation, the claim was their mayor and their city council were so effective in chasing Met Council out, and that's what attracted the homeowner or the property owner to their land, is they fought the Met Council and won, and they're much better than the community that currently reside in. And so, the person happens to be a developer, and he knows the value of half the lot size. And he also knows the value, he approached us for even 1 acre lot sizes on that. And it's approximately 500 acres. There are others that are waiting to see how that goes, to know if they can come in right behind him. So we're anticipating a parade of people looking to transfer, so they can take their large lots and develop in 2.5 acres. So I think one question is, within that, if we've got the same development plan that we have for 2030, we have acceptable lot sizes and the backup septic systems, within those that are vying to leave our community, is there something that the Met Council would not necessarily bless, but approve in those incremental adjustments that we could offer as well on those border places that keep us from being annexed apart because somebody has that many more dollar signs available to them simply by filing with the state?
And we've talked with Liz about this too, of that, that flexibility in lot size, or we should say, when we talk about density, we're not talking about a specific lot size, except when you start to talk about divvying up all your land into 2 acres. That's the kind of development pattern that we're really concerned with. But that being said, there are a lot of different ways to do development that has a variety of lot sizes within it and allows for densities that would kind of net out the same or yield the same number of housing units that a 2.5 acre or whatever development pattern that you're considering, that continue to do all of the other things that we've talked about, protecting those natural resources like wetlands and ensuring for long-term viability of your septic systems. There are ways to do that, and we'd encourage you to explore those. We're happy to provide examples for how other communities around the region have done that as well. It's not always through a PUD. There are other ways to accommodate that type of different development pattern. That's not necessarily just 2 or 2.5 acres across the board. It's true, it is easier to do it that way. I fully recognize it's very easy to take a plat and to divide it up into 2.5 acre lots and to cash that out easily. I get that. The development costs make a difference. At the end of the day, it's also a community, you're living here too, and you're also decision makers in deciding both, is that in the best interest of the public, is that gonna serve us well, and are there any ramifications that we have to deal with?
But I think the biggest ramification that the mayor and the council are stressing is that if we go with the philosophy of the Met Council, to have the larger lot sizes and have less density, which everybody I think would agree ultimately may make it easier to develop sewer and water. However, if there is further annexation detachment requests, we already know when one person approached the city of Oak Grove, 3 or 4 other residents also approached, and now we have, is that going to be something that the Met Council is going to support? Because they will have to come in for a comp plan change when that land gets annexed in. Are you going to reluctantly bless it, or are you going to say, no, this land needs to be at the higher lot sizes so that we don't preclude future sewer and water service in this area?
So I'll back up again and restate that you do have the flexibility to do higher densities than just 10 acre lots. I'm going to say that as many times as I can. You're not limited to a 10 acre lot. You have flexibility to consider. Those principles should be followed that I've already discussed. You have a lot of options to consider that allow for development that are still consistent with regional policies. So I want to start there. Second, in annexation cases, the council doesn't provide a recommendation. That's per our agreement with the Office of Municipal Boundary Adjustments. The administrative law judge is the decider in that case. The council provides information in the case to support kind of laying the facts around the case, what plans are for each community, who's involved in any case, what their forecasted growth is, plans for infrastructure, et cetera. We kind of lay that based on the fact as a third party, not a party to the actual case itself. I will say, at a high level though, that the council always has supported orderly annexation agreements and any changes among communities that are agreed upon by both communities. Because our charge as the regional planning agency is for orderly and economical development. It's in the best interest of all jurisdictions to know what's going to be in their jurisdiction in the long term, to be able to make long-term decisions. And if you have folks that are kind of popping in and out, that makes that long-term planning a lot harder to do on any jurisdiction, whether you're a township, a city, a county, or a municipality, or a regional body. So kind of at a high level philosophy, that's where the council has always been at. So it will be the administrative law judge who makes the decision in this case. The council doesn't make a recommendation. We always just carry out whatever happens.
The question wasn't whether a recommendation that you would give to the ALJ. The question was, based on your policies of the Metropolitan Council, if the judge, administrative law judge, after listening to all the evidence, would decide that it's in the best interest of the region, the property owners, the cities, to detach and annex the land to the city of Oak Grove, arguably, so Oak Grove is going to, because that's what the developers want, is the 2.5 acre lot. That would necessitate a comp plan amendment. And the question is, when that happens, because at this point in time, the judge has already spoken. You're not giving advice to a judge,
Right.
you are just reviewing the policy of that, like you're going to be doing for us. What would be the policy of the Met Council in that situation?
The council's approach to land runs with the land and not with its jurisdiction. It doesn't, so if the land is in one community, we have communities who will annex, let's say, agricultural land on a regular basis. So that doesn't change our policy for that. We're still guarding that ag, unless something changes that we're not predicting. And that would be the same in this case too.
So if the
Our
land was going to be annexed, detached and annexed to Oak Grove, and right now this is part of the diversified rural, I think I'm using that term correctly, then it would, under Met Council policy, it would remain diversified rural? And
Now, that's the big argument though, because of course, the promise from the Oak Grove Council was, once you become part of Oak Grove, you become part of Oak Grove, and we have nothing to do with the Met Council, and everything is 2.5. And that was the attraction. It's like we get out from underneath Met Council jurisdiction, in their opinion, and they can go to 2.5 immediately. And so
That would
you know,
not be consistent with state law.
so when we were looking at the draft, section 4 of their land use plan for the comp plan, it was very confusing to me because the whole first portion of it is diversified rural, 4 per 40. And it says that strongly suggested by the Met Council, recommended, here's how you do it. And then we get back into the portion that looks like Oak Grove wrote, and they put in the 2.5. So it was confusing to us, which one is it? And the big question was, if you're moving this land, if you're moving the boundary, because now you immediately go to the 2.5, and as a developer, that's very attractive. That's an important question. Is it still diversified rural, and are you still going to not only not bless it, but not support the 2.5 in a diversified rural, just because they changed communities?
Sure, and I will tell you, as staff, I can give you the staff recommendation on that, is how we've carried that out. I can't speak to what our council would ultimately say, but ultimately, staff recommendation would be that, because that has always been staff recommendation on annexation cases. It's just as if another community annexed land from, let's say, a smaller municipality annex land from an agricultural township. It stays agricultural until it's been changed to something else. I'm not familiar with the Oak Grove mayor's statements, but certainly recent legislation did not exempt them from Metropolitan Council jurisdiction. That's not what the legislation said. It was only specific to the southeast corner of their community and about that being rural residential. It did not speak to any other portions of planning or relationship with the council. So I'm not sure where that perception is coming from or what that's based on, but that the legislation is very short. It's only a couple of sentences, so if you're interested in reading it, we'd be happy to share it.
I guess I would like to see it.
Mhm.
And also, you had mentioned several times, maybe it was Eric, the area, and this seems to be a major thing here, about the flexibility. I know I've helped communities put in community treatment systems, things, but what other, that's what comes to my mind. I know maybe doing clusters and keeping open space is maybe another option, but there may be other stuff from a planning perspective that either Liz or I or the council, the planning commission haven't seen, and we would love to see, we'd love to have some other ideas, especially about what that might be
Yeah,
on
absolutely.
that.
Well, I think that many of you will have seen some of these examples before, but I think what's maybe worth stressing is that you can combine some of these different tactics or, you know,
You might use
methods.
some in one area and others in another
You know,
area
so-
or altogether.
You could still have you could still end up with the gross density that you're after, but you could still allow for 2.5 acres in certain areas that are maybe more appropriate for that, as long as you're still getting that gross density. A lot of you will have seen this kind of, I used to work for a rural township, and this was common where, again, this is where the sewer service was coming, and you could only allow so many splits per quarter kind of thing. And in this type of situation, you've got people that are splitting off for the grandkids or what have you, but then reserving that area for future. This is very common. We see this a lot in the region.
When I worked in Nicollet County, this is what we used to manage the agricultural landscape.
And a lot of you will be familiar with this, but there's also other methods, like for instance, where you put the house on the parcel can really help you in future if you were ever to subdivide again. Quite often people will put the house right in the middle of their lot, which then you can't subdivide it because you're not allowing that opportunity. So this is quite often, it's a build-out plan, but you might have heard of it referred to as ghost platting. There's also more area-wide plans that can be employed. For instance, creating like outlots where you can actually have areas that you are pretty sure in future may be served. And you can reserve those areas for development. And that's what it could potentially look like when you have your larger lots in a particular area. One thing I will say to your point, which I think is important, is that we do have a lot of examples and we can help with that. There are a lot of great examples in our region of communities who have done this very successfully and still maintain a rural character, and I think it's important, and obviously that's a real important goal for now then. One thing I wanted to mention about Liz's presentation earlier is I was in Ramsey last week, and I mean, it's one thing if now then never wants sewer, but I think that the development pressures are real, and they're coming to the city whether or not, whatever the city decides to do in terms of its long-term goals. So what I want to just emphasize is that, for instance, with the city of Ramsey to the south, we've seen them change I think they've changed their sewer boundary 3 or 4 times this year. And that's just because there's a lot of people wanting to develop. But also, their sewer district is actually very, very far north, and it's actually really close to the now-then border. So I'm only raising that point because if the city of now-then did want to reserve areas for future sewer, there's a real possibility that even within the next 10 to 20 years that you might find that you know, through discussions with the city of Ramsey, that you might want to connect part of Now Then for some development. You know, that would be up to the city, obviously, but my advice, I suppose, would be it's always good to keep these options open for future development. One thing I want to emphasize, and I think Lisa probably won't say this, but there's a misconception out there that the Met Council is going around forcing people to connect to sewer, and that's just not the case. If anything, it's actually the opposite.
We prefer it.
I'm not going to name communities, but there's been some communities currently going through the comprehensive plan process that developed at 2.5 acre lots. And now a lot of their residents are coming to us and asking, we want to connect because, you know, I want to run a commercial business or what have you, and we can't do it. We, you know, septic, we don't have a big enough septic area or whatever. And I just say, you're going to have to talk to the city about this because it's up to the city whether or not they want sewer. They need to come and talk to us. We're never going to come into Now Then and say, you have to connect. The only time that would ever happen is if the MPCA gets involved, if you've got some huge pollution problem, which you're not going to have here. It's more often the case that the cities are asking us, you know, can we connect? And we tend to accommodate that when we can. But again, it has to make dollars and cents sense to do that. So I guess I just want the city to think about its future, you know, 30 years down the line, you might be in a position where you might want to sewer some lots. And you'll kind of want to have that ability because if you close that door, then it's going to be closed.
Can I give a scenario? So, for instance, let's say we decide we want, instead of 8 for 40, we're going to go with 16 for 40. So we allow the 16 lots to be, let's say, 1 acre, and the street cost is less because, you know, they're closer together, they don't have as much lot width. They can be served potentially by a shared system, with the ability to hook up later. But as you told me on the phone, it's not necessarily, just because you're doing that doesn't mean you're going to have services. So if you could talk about that a little bit.
Right, absolutely. I mean, development patterns like that don't mean that now you need to have urban services at all. As we mentioned, kind of that long-term maintenance of that, whether it's a shared septic or an individual septic, is really what's going to kind of keep you maintaining that development pattern in the long time, or in the long term. So while a lot of our guidance has been written around reserving land for future urban development, that doesn't necessarily need to be the case for many portions of the region that we don't plan on providing sewer service to, where communities are using that reservation of land to really just preserve that rural atmosphere and really keep it, this is not going to be developed, we're going to put our homes here and save this, whether it's a vista or a parkland or a natural area or ag land, continued smaller ag, which we've been seeing more trends in, especially like in Washington County, is around hobby farms and other smaller agricultural uses. That those are different ways of preserving rural atmosphere that don't necessarily require extension of urban services. They also don't preclude it either.
What is the Met Council staff's position with regard to like community treatment systems? I know that I've helped a lot of communities put those in outstate, particularly where failing septics, and we have to come in, but usually the town comes in and we fix it, create a subordinate service district for the finance mechanism, and then we manage it on behalf of these residents. And I've also done larger systems for a lot of development, like, you know, something like Kent Raisler would want to do, where we've done those. And nowadays, when you build these, you build them so that they can connect if a pipe comes by. If something like that would be done, what would be your position with regard to lot sizes? Would you be favorable to 1 acre lots or so, as long as it was something, and typically, if you have enough lots, it's 10,000 gallons per day,
Yep.
it's gotta be permitted by the MPCA.
Mhm.
So you have that, and some counties even have their own ordinances, regulatory oversight type of things as well. So again, that would also be for people that want to develop, but you'd want to preserve that ability for future services and infrastructure services, big pipe, sewer, and water. This would be still requiring wells, because we wouldn't be doing that, but I guess you could do a community water system, and we did that one in Territory and stuff, but I wouldn't, you get Department of Health involved, it's just, kind of not worth it sometimes. But you could typically do water wells, and you could also give people some options for development with more density, but there is a little bit more of a cost, but that cost I see has been coming down as the treatment systems are becoming more accepted and people have more experience with them. But that is another option that would preserve different rights you might want to consider.
So, and just let me put a disclaimer in there, because we've had some challenges in the city here before where people like to discuss options and ideas, and we have to have a disclaimer in there. This is our city attorney simply discussing options that he's seen in other places. And I want to go on record for anybody, especially if they're turning in the middle of our video here on YouTube, that we are not currently changing anything. We're not currently considering these as next step options, but simply saying, here are possibilities so that we understand fully what to present to our residents before we make a final decision on anything. So this is an opportunity to listen, to ask questions. No decisions are being made, and we're not moving forward at all. So anybody watching this needs to understand that we're simply discussing options, and that's it.
Mr. Mayor,
Councilmember Bettinger.
we do have one of them systems in the city of Nalvin, it's the Morton Farm Preserve. It was a PUD, but the sewer system is privately owned by the people that live in that residential area. They
Yeah.
pay for it, it's monitored by, it used to be Connexus, I'm not sure who monitors it anymore. But we do have a system like that, and a lot of people that live there, they love it. There's nice homes, it's like living in town.
If it's properly maintained, it does work.
But the rest of the residents here, when you go out and visit them, that drive by it, they don't like it.
Really?
Yes, they want,
What would be
there's a
the-
lot of people out here that want everybody to have 5 acres.
Oh, okay.
And that's their definition of rural, is 5 acre lots.
Yeah, if you did go with the community treatment systems, if that is something that the planning commission and the council are looking at, it does have, I would recommend that it not be privately owned. Do not let a homeowners association, do not let a private entity, a company run it. You guys want to have an ownership of that. And typically, we would do that in the very beginning with the developer, and we create what they call a subordinate service district. And that gives you the finance mechanism for anybody that lives within that boundary of that district, which is the plat, that pays for it. And it can be expanded and adjusted and so forth. But the problems that I have seen in other communities, where typically the city council or the town board gets involved, is where somebody didn't think about that 20 or 30 years ago. They let a homeowners association run it. People don't want to charge themselves, so they never got the money necessary. They didn't hire the right people to maintain it. Now the system is starting to fail, and they want the government to come in and fix it. We can do that, but it's a retrofit. It's a complete kind of do-over, and that causes a lot of heartache. So there's ways to set this up if you do it from beginning, where you look at how to do it properly, and it does work. So it is an option for you. It's not as simple as the big pipe. Obviously, that is the one everybody would like, but it is an option, and it does work, and the people that live there, as long as they maintain it, it does work properly.
Mr. Mayor, if I may, earlier you had asked what the council's, or what council staff would think of those types of systems. And generally, we have supported that same approach of the city should be involved, because we've experienced the same thing across the region with private ownership not keeping them up as well. But when they are properly maintained, are a really great alternative. Especially, especially where you do have environmental constraints, it allows you to kind of move that development off of that and keep, especially where you might have some limitations to have enough upland for development, to have room for a backup, it can really consolidate that demand in some areas. So if the city is interested in that, it might be a way, in some areas where you might have a lot of wetlands, a way to develop or allow for development in a different type of development pattern. It's an option that's available to the community to consider.
And I think that the councilman's comments that the people that live in the planned unit development do really love it. It's a smaller neighborhood, a lot of young families, a lot of interaction. The people driving by on Highway 47 look over and say, what's that? That doesn't look right out here in the midst of this community. Again, I think that the pressure is going to be on for those that like the look of open spaces. And you know, 5-acre developments can look pretty crowded when you're out here. The problem is going to be the developers that come in and say, I'm this close to 2.5, and you're only allowing 5. Now again, we've got an average. We've done some creative things with wetlands, with upland requirements, with backup septic systems. So we have some creativity in individual developments that average 5 acres, because these people have the wetlands and these people don't. So you might see the smaller lots in some of those things. But to know that if the neighboring community has that same concept with 2.5 acres, you can get the wetlands, and we can go slightly smaller than that. And that's going to be, not that the residents are going to do it, though if somebody has land that they're looking to retire off of, that developer's going to see that attraction. And that continues to be our threat. Whether we want to keep our 5 acres and larger, the developer's going to start snipping around the edges if we don't have some way of compensating those landholders creatively without affecting the whole city.
Or another thing is, we need the support of the Met Council. The only way this works is if somebody seeks the blessing of the city that they want to go to. In this case, Oak Grove, under current law, Oak Grove has to support that annexation. They have done so in this situation with the property owners that want to detach and annex. But that incentive would go if the Met Council would say, if you change the boundary of the city to incorporate this other area, the land use designation stays the same. In other words, if it's just for zoning and not for sewer or water or other municipal services, which doesn't appear to be the case with Oak Grove, it's pretty parity. That's what we also need, is if the city council does go and support the Met Council's goals and enacts policies that would support those goals, we don't want those used against us every time somebody, a developer, could see, oh, I could make more money, and everybody votes with their pocketbook. That's, other thing that we would need is your support.
Well, and the other concern is in our northeast corner, we're close to a rural center in St. Francis. And that's even greater density that starts sneaking down. And so one of the main reasons we incorporated was to protect ourselves from the township days of seeing the development going on around us and just being carved up by pressure from the west in Elk River. There was talk as a city administrator in Ramsey was eyeing our southern border, even though it was a long way from their development. You start looking around and saying, okay, how do we protect ourselves? So incorporation was a big part of that. If incorporation didn't really help us, and we're still going to get carved up, that's where, if people have the idea, just by jumping to one of these communities with greater density, we can take your land and carve it up to our current density, not what it's currently rated, but valuable.
And I would say in my experience of tracking annexation cases in the metro for the last 10 years, that this is unusual. This is the first, actually only the second case that we've seen, this is the most substantial one where we've seen a detachment from one city and an attachment to another community without the sending, without agreement amongst both communities. The previous one that we had reviewed many years ago was in Lake Elmo, and ultimately ended up as an island of a township that had been fully annexed. The southern portion of it had been fully annexed by the city of Stillwater. So there's this small, I think it's about 50 acres of now what's in the township that none of the other cities in the area will annex or provide services to. So now it's a floater, if you will. And the township, Stillwater Township to the north of the city of Stillwater, says, what are we supposed to do with that now that we didn't want that, and Lake Elmo didn't want it to go either. And they were in a similar place where they were trying to get sewer services for more development, and no one was planning to give them development. That was many years ago. I don't know how the administrative law judge would find in this case, but it is unusual. I would say to only have 2 cases in 10 years with this type of difference of not having agreements amongst the municipalities where that land is changing.
I've got a question. The same developer's over on the east side development, he's got land over on the west side too. And so, if we lose over here, we're probably gonna lose over there too. And what I've got to say is, why can't the Met Council, I know they don't have any power, they're appointed by the governor, and I know there's no power, but why can't they go to bat for us with administration judge? Why can't they come there and defend us? Because this is a big thing over in our border over here. And like it was pointed out earlier, is everybody else is gonna jump on the bandwagon. And it's gonna continue to happen. It's gonna happen in St. Francis, it's gonna happen in Ramsey, all around us. Unless you guys defend us, you were no good to us. Absolutely no good. Because when you guys first came in here and you wanted to put this sewer system, potential sewer system in, we asked why did it have to go over there? You wanted it over there. And we finally got it over here. We wanted it right up from Ramsey, right down the middle here. Why wasn't it put here? And this was a big battle we had with you guys.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Ames, I'm not familiar with those discussions preceded my time at the council, so I apologize for any, not crossing and connecting with you folks on meeting your needs at that time. I'm not familiar with those, maybe Liz can speak to that. But I would say, Mr. Ames, that regarding, as I had mentioned earlier, the council's always been more supportive of annexations when both jurisdictions are agreeing upon them, and when they're not and they're contested, it's not something that we've ever promoted. We have been having conversations internally within our agency about how we navigate in this, given our interagency agreement with the ALJ and how we work with them, what our role is and how we may show up in that. There's still some time, so I don't know what that looks like yet. That's still being discussed internally in my agency, but certainly, and I will restate this, that we don't, as staff, we don't support communities kind of annexing land without having conversations with their neighbors and having that agreement with their neighbors, whether that's 2 cities or a city and a township. We also don't support just kind of that continued kind of growth in a township. We prefer that to be happening in a way that is planned and is orderly and is agreed upon by both communities.
I will point out, when we had that public hearing here, and the Met Council was out here, we were threatened that we would be sued if we didn't go along with them. That was by one of the commissioners.
Okay.
And it does predate you.
Yes.
We apologize that you're stuck with it, but it left a very bad taste in the mouth of people that still live here.
I understand that.
We were going to be the next, was it Lake Elmo?
Okay. Not.
And we were going to be dragged through the streets if we didn't.
But why aren't you there to go to this administration judge in our defense? Because
Well, again,
They
that's,
review it.
the council has limitations, but they are in conversation.
but they're appointed
With the
by
law
the
judge.
but they're appointed by the governor. Why isn't he on the ball?
I don't have control over his work plan. I apologize for that.
It is, Commissioner Ames, it is something that the Met Council understands the issues involved. They are, it sounds like they're internally discussing those issues.
Yes.
This is staff.
Right.
they don't make policy, so they can try to advise the people that do make policy what they think is best for the overall area and the region. The administrative law judge is something separate and apart. That person can listen to whatever evidence is presented to them, and the parties will. It'll be a trial where all the factors that it's in the statutes will be presented to them. Administrative law judge will take it all under advisement, then he will go back to his office, review everything, and then issue an order. It is something that the Met Council will be part of that trial. They're not a party, but they do provide information, background, and answer the questions of the administrative law judge from a geographic regional planning agency and what their policies are. And that's why we've been trying to find out, well, what is the Met Council's policy with regard to that? And it appears that the Met Council's policy has not changed. And even if the judge did annex the properties, Kent Raisler and some of the others, to the city of Oak Grove, it does not automatically change the zoning of those properties from right now. The zoning is diversified rural to rural residential.
Land use.
I'm sorry, the land use, from diversified, I can't think of the name, diversified rural to rural residential. The rural residential is the one that allows for the 2.5 acres. And if that judge did order it, that's well within the rights of the judge, but it doesn't automatically mean that the Met Council, which is a separate agency, that land would still be within the boundary of Oak Grove, but it does not necessarily mean that the property owners that reside on that property will get the zoning that they actually think they will. And I guess that's a wait and see.
However, though, I mean, what I thought I heard was, so it goes to the administrative law judge, they make a recommendation, or they have input to it, but it's ultimately his or her decision, and they make the decision that it becomes Oak Grove. Now Oak Grove has to amend their comp plan because they've got 500 acres or 600 acres more in it. I think I heard amendments to their comp plan doesn't necessarily go through the same jurisdiction as an overall plan if it doesn't impact the regional system. So they could very easily say, we're gonna amend our comp plan with this new 500 acres to 2.5 acres. It doesn't go through the same branch because it's an amendment versus the overall plan. And if it doesn't impact the regional system, they can't deny the application.
So, Mr. Alders, you're correct that we do review amendments under a smaller threshold because they're typically smaller in size. 500 acres is pretty substantial. We have communities around the region that are smaller in size than that.
And they could submit it at 40-acre increments too, though, right?
That would be unusual to do that. Once new land becomes part of a community's jurisdiction, we expect them to provide for that land use immediately because that is the guiding document.
Totally understand, but it's a little unorthodox that we're getting 500 acres being asked to annex into a neighboring town as well. So that
Right.
it's a very likely scenario that this could happen through an amendment and it could roll through as a 2.5. I mean, it's a possibility.
Sure, they got 2,000 acres changed, so I'm sure they can get 500 acres changed.
Or they could say, well, let's do it in 100-acre increments over the next 3 years.
Well, Mr. Alders, what I would say though is that development couldn't occur on the property that had been brought into Oak Grove if they didn't provide a guided land use within their comprehensive plan for that development. And once boundaries change in the community, then the expectation is that if you're amending the plan and only bringing part in, that your application is incomplete until you bring all of it in. So we wouldn't consider incremental changes when we know that the boundary has changed, and if that does occur, we know that has occurred, then that needs to be shown as part of the plan and what they're gonna be doing for that.
So if it switches from a 1 in 10 to a 2.5 acre scenario, is that a big enough change to the impact of the regional system, knowing that Nalvin is gonna remain at 5 acres for the rest of their lots? Because if you look at the regional system, the overall density is gonna change. You're gonna add 30 or 40 more people to the area versus the original plan. So
that becomes the question, is that enough of an impact to the regional system or not?
Well, that's something we'd have to consider, but Mr. Alders, our expectation for guided land uses in that property are the same as what we have for your community and being in your, whether that land stays within your community or goes to Oak Grove, our expectations are the same for that land.
So they would be asking for a change from diversified rural to something else. And keep in mind the timing of it, is their comp plan update has not been reviewed or approved. So chances are they're going to, or would, assuming an annexation, add that into the plan, redo it, and then submit it. So it's a full-blown comp plan review. It's not an amendment at that point.
The question comes down to, is the standard? Is this an impact on the
Sure.
regional system? And the way I heard your comments is that staff believes that this would be considered a negative impact on the regional system.
Well, I don't want to go to that legal point yet because I haven't seen their plan, so we don't like to conjecture about what our finding might be. But I do want to say that the standard of reviewing that land would be the same as if it were in your community, regardless of which jurisdiction.
The other thing worth mentioning is that the regional policy states that actually adding land to rural residential is discouraged and inconsistent with regional policy. So changing from diversified rural to rural residential in that area, we would view that as a policy inconsistency. Now, how that plays out is another matter. But
Councilmember Rainville.
To the Met Council. So what you just said, Eric, is that consistent whether it's within this big comp plan change? They're fortunate enough now that this is happening during the time everybody's looking at their comp plan. Is that the same, would they be held to the same standards whether it's this or later on, say next year or the year after?
that's correct.
Yes, that is
Okay.
correct.
And it's the same for every community. The regional policy states that it's discouraging and basically saying that the rural residential should not be expanded across the region. And that's part of the reason that this conversation is with now then is, it's challenging, and I understand the city's point of view because you have the MUSA removed from that area. So you ask the question, and the question is a natural question, why do we need to keep this area diversified rural? Well, the regional policy states that, we're not encouraging expansion of the rural residential because of all the reasons that have been outlined earlier. Now, saying all that, the city can still decide where it wants that diversified rural area to be, and I think that's something that was brought up the last two meetings, and I think the city, it's really at the city's discretion how it wants to do that, and we would fully support the city and help them in that process.
Exploring options and different things, absolutely.
So,
Mr. Mayor?
Councilmember Rainville, sorry.
So question for Met Council. So, we have roughly, 800 acres over there. Are we required to do the same number of acres elsewhere? If we were unsuccessful in removing the diversified rural and we, but have the ability to move it elsewhere, are we obligated to stay with the same acreage?
When we look at what the policy is for diversified rural and for rural residential in our regional policy, we encourage the same principles where where opportunities exist for development. We have larger lots in your rural residential as well as in your diversified rural for the same types of flexibility that we've discussed earlier in this meeting. If you're applying those principles for development across your community consistently, that requirement, especially because it's not associated with MUSA, is not necessarily going to be an issue. So we really want to look, we'll work with your staff too when you guys have some land use proposals that you want to consider, and we'll look at that for broader consistency across all of our policies, where you're making changes and where there are opportunities for additional development. Does that make sense? And does that get to what the council's regional goal is that long-term rural sustainable development pattern? Because it's not associated with MUSA, that acreage is not a hard and fast requirement per se.
Mr. Mayor,
Councilmember Bettinger.
before the 2030 plan, our whole community was rural residential. You forced us into change it to 720 acres. Why can't we go back to our rural residential the way we were before the 2030 plan? That's what we were, and that's what we wanted to be, but we were forced.
Mr. Mayor, Commissioner, Councilmember, Liz had shown some earlier guidance. I think you had permanent rural for a while. I don't know when diversified rural entered the picture. And then that was negotiated as being different as part of the 2030 process as well, to go from fully diversified rural to art rural residential diversified rural. And then we'll kind of go back to what we talked about earlier with our administration's policies changing over time as the council has, as our region has grown, as our administration's directions have been more focused on retaining a very rural landscape and trying to prevent some of the issues that we've had with mismanagement of both community and other private septics around the region. That's really what the council is trying to avoid, having more of that proliferation in the future. So, so what you might be asking to go back to are designations that don't exist in our policy. But I think what we want to say is, from my recollection of the 2 plans ago, what that rural area spoke to is that the high level goals of what we've been talking about tonight and what that plan had said maybe 20 years ago was really that maintenance of the long-term rural landscape.
That's not true, because when I got into town board, we were rural residential 5-acre lots across the board.
I'm not trying to misstate
So do
anything.
I.
I'm doing the best from my memory, especially because it does.
Dale can
precede me.
testify to that.
Right.
It's,
I'm not
and
intending
you
to
guys are
argue.
trying to change things on us, reword things, and you can't do that. I mean, our plan was approved, we were rural residential 5-acre lots across the board. And then you come out here for our 2030 plan and you made us change 720 acres, or you threatened us. And all we want to do is go back to where we were and go back to the rural residential 5-acre lots.
One, Mr. Mayor,
Mayor Stockman.
I mean, an alternative way to think about this, I mean, don't think about it as a change in density, because if you're allowing 8 for 40, you're still only going to allow 8 for 40. I mean, that could be your choice, but you're just putting those residences closer together, and you're preserving the rest of the 40. I mean, that's a different way to think about it. And you could also think about it as a positive option, in that you can split up your diversified rural. You could put some next to Elk River on 181st. You could put some where it is at 47 and 22, and use it for senior developments, other options that we currently don't have, other types of possible housing scenarios. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing, but just a thought.
Mr. Mayor.
Councilmember Bryan?
One challenge that I see is, to Councilmember Bettinger's point, it almost seems like you're penalizing the people. Wherever you put the diversified rural, you're penalizing them. You have everyone else in the city that is under rural residential, and then whether you keep it in the area that it's at, whether you move it to a totally different corner, or you spread it all out over the entire city, you're still penalizing the people that are there, because they have to abide by different rules and regulations. it seems like right now that area is kind of an island, because if you're looking right now today, if you're looking at moving everything around, it's gotta come either all the way across from the west, or all the way across from the north, or all the way through Oak Grove and under, through a river, or come all the way up from Ramsey, and it just doesn't, if the intention is to possibly, maybe sometime in the future, plan for, the potential of maybe having, sewer and water, then maybe that's something that we, as a city, can work through and encourage it with our planner to say, hey, at least think of this as maybe possibly an option as you're platting out, where you could get more lots in that area, but not be forced into it. And that's, I think, all we're asking is, we want to treat all our residents the same. It's rural residential.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Brevin, as I mentioned earlier, you do have a lot of options all across the board, and there are things that are already in your current plan for your 5-acre lots that Liz has mentioned that might also be suitable in these areas. And as I mentioned before, to the earlier question of are we kind of, I think it was your question, this 800 acres. Well, if you're doing this long-term sustainable rural development pattern that has kind of abided by this natural resource protection and long-term sewer service protection, that may very well be consistent with both our diversified rural policies and our rural residential policies, and this becomes less of an issue. We really like you to focus on what are the things you'd like to accomplish in your own land use planning, and working with Liz, we're happy to help you make sure that is consistent. From everything we're hearing from you folks today, it sounds like we are sharing those values in that retaining of the rural landscape, and as your attorney had mentioned too, of ensuring that you're not having mismanagement of your septic systems, and that these things are maintained in the long term. So I don't see that we're disagreeing. I'm finding that we do have a lot of shared value there, and I think that we can get to a solution that's going to meet your needs.
But you're still insisting on designating a certain amount of acreage as this diversified rural area.
And I guess, if I could, I guess that's my question. If our new plan has no diversified rural, could that be acceptable with our outlines we have of, having at least 1.5 acres per lot of buildable area and things like that, so we have the backup septic systems? If we basically, our next plan doesn't have diversified rural at all.
So, Mr. Mayor and Mr. What I would offer is that you should work on your land use plan and what you want to do in your land use planning. Don't worry about what our designations are and where they fall, and really think about those principles that we've been discussing this evening. Because if you're meeting those, then the regional designation and where that line is less significant. That's not as important. But I really want to focus on that policy piece. That's the important part, where you have opportunities for development of having that long-term sustainable rural development pattern.
Let me say a couple things first. For the commissioners here, please get the presiding officer's attention, because we are on video and we need to call out names, and it would help Lisa to know who she's talking to. So I can say Commissioner Wagner, so she'll know. Lisa, I want to thank you. I hope you're getting hazard pay for this tonight. It's certainly much better than our previous encounters with Met Council representatives. And Councilman Rainville, before I get to you, I think the question that comes up, you're hearing in different forms, why do we need any of this diversified rural designation when in our past history we did not have it? And the bigger question came up. We understood when it was imposed upon us in the 2030 plan that it was to be consolidated. At one point it was multiple parts of the city, and the water tables and neighboring communities plans didn't support that. So it was concentrated on the major highway running all the way from Ramsey up to St. Francis, thinking they either come down from St. Francis up from Ramsey, and so that was a concentration there. In some of the options that we've heard discussed as diversified rural could be used to maintain environmental conditions, agricultural areas. It could be distributed, so it's gone from a central planning for future sewer system that isn't even in the 40-year plan, or the 2040 plan and beyond, to potentially being distributed piecemeal throughout the city as the city sees fit. So if it's no longer intended for the coming sewer, what I'm hearing is you're saying someday in somebody's lifetime, maybe not ours, but somebody's lifetime, there will be some type of sewer in our community. And what the council is asking is consider that as you develop further, so that's more readily accomplished than the plan Oak Grove's going with 2.5 acres, which will be, you're gonna have this farmhouse here and neighborhoods develop around it. We've seen it in Andover, we've seen it in a lot of different places. The old farmhouse is here with an odd lot, and everybody else is platted in around that. And so the only thing that I can see, if we're going to be able to take that diversified rural and distribute it as we see fit to fit our plans, it would, first of all, have to be amenable to the landowners' long-term plans. But otherwise, it doesn't make sense to distribute that because it's not to a contiguous sewer system, but just a sewer system at some point that those houses could tap into. Otherwise, the argument that Councilmember Bryan and Councilmember Bettinger are making is, why have any of it at all? And so rather than have, we'll keep attacking on that, that seems to be the premier question. If we can distribute it wherever, what's the value to the Met, from the Met Council's point of view?
Sure, the value really is that what I had talked about earlier is really preventing a request for sewer services before it's even planned for. There are, unfortunately, not everybody manages their systems the way that they should. Not everyone's on top of that. Not all municipalities take care of that as they can. And as your city attorney has noted, sometimes when it's left to homeowners associations and others, they're unwilling to invest in that. And we have across the region many times been called and directed by others at the state to fix issues because of public health issues. We don't want folks to be coming up on something that they can't afford to do on their own. And that's really what we're asking you to consider as you're considering different development patterns at higher densities. We don't want to provide sewer services when we're not planning for providing sewer services. When you consider a different development pattern, if something does occur in your community where you're at a point where you're either wanting to consider that and requesting that, and this might be 50+ years in the future, then these development patterns won't prevent that from occurring. This makes it a lot easier to economically provide services when they are available. It also makes it, in many cases, especially on some community systems that the city might be managing, a little bit of a lighter lift on property owners as well. So just kind of keeping that in mind. But I will go to your point, Mr. Mayor. There are other ways of managing the rural landscape that are really great for protecting natural resources and for also retaining some smaller lot agricultural practices as well that that we have been seeing more of an uptick in more recently. Some of these smaller productions of organic farms and some, of course, hobby farms and some other types that have been springing up more commonly. That those types of demands for agriculture might not be on 120 acres any longer, but might be more of a 10 or 20 acre. But you might have some development around it as well. These types of development patterns can help accommodate that and still retain your rural landscape, kind of accommodate that 8 per 40 as Liz was saying, and still retain some of those rural patterns. So really thinking about that rural pattern, thinking about how you can important in your community. It might be ag in some areas, it might be natural resource in other areas. And in other areas, it might be an opportunity or to manage the landscape. In other areas, it might be because you have just a lot of environmental constraints. You just might have too many wetlands to really fit in lots here and there, where it might make more sense to have a shared community septic. So I'd really encourage you to look at what's on your land and your landscape as a way to manage that landscape and considering those different options.
Councilmember Rainville.
So am I hearing you state that, given our existing zoning requirements, our existing policies, that we don't have to, we're not obligated to put the rural, or diversified rural on our new 2040 map, but as landowners bring us the opportunity, with them developing their land, that we consider many different facets of how that land can be developed, that's sufficient, so we don't have to worry about putting that classification of diversified rural on our map?
Right, Mr. Mayor and Ms. Renville, yes, right now you have MUSA is on your map because that was a very specific, that we're gonna provide sewer here. On your guided land use map, Ms. Brown, that's not necessary. You can call your guided land uses whatever you'd like to call them. What we're really gonna be looking at are the development policies that you have associated with them.
So would that be shown in the zoning ordinance?
Your requirements for development?
Well, I mean,
The diversified rural?
the goal sort of is to try and keep diversified rural to some extent. But you're saying we don't have to actually have, if the land was, it's getting late here.
Yeah.
If the land was zoned rural residential throughout the town, but we had policies in place that the Met Council has reviewed and could support, and we agreed that we wouldn't modify those policies, would that be if you wanted to develop of a certain density that you needed to do a community system or something else that could further the goal that the Met Council has, yet keep the rural character? It's not the zoning designation that you're concerned about, it's the ultimate ability to effectively, economically provide sewer to this area at some point in time in the future.
Mr. Mayor, yes, Mr. Ruby, that and or prevent having to provide sewer prematurely. Right.
And so then again, just to clarify, the planning that we would do that takes into consideration some of the options that the Met Council and our planner have discussed. So if we're looking at protecting rural wetlands or natural resources or whatever it might be, that would be part of our planning.
Absolutely.
But we wouldn't have to designate.
Right. So, right, Mr. Mayor, and Liz is familiar with kind of how those principles would lay out, but in your comprehensive plan where you describe your different land use districts and what is allowable in your guided plan, you would also identify kind of these are the things that our goals for these areas, this particular area, we're thinking of this, or where these conditions exist, and whatever those conditions might be, whether it's many wetlands or a high-quality natural resource that you've identified as important in your community. Where these conditions exist, these are the expectations for development at higher densities or at whatever density that the community has for those types of areas. There are a lot of different ways you can lay that out. You could be under a conditional piece, or you could be more geographically specific. There's a lot of different options for how you lay that out, and then, of course, as your attorney has stated, that your zoning ordinance would then carry that out in more specific detail as far as lot size, setbacks, etc.
Here's what I would suggest, and I don't, Lisa can maybe jump in here, he's the expert. I can see why people are confused, because we have this community designation that's called diversified rural, that sits on top of the land, so to speak. And you have land use, which Liz deals with, and you all deal with too, then you have zoning beneath that, right? So you've got these three things. When we're talking about the community designation, that's not necessarily a land use tool as such. It's
It's our policy expectation
It's,
for
it's looking at how the development pattern it exists and what we're seeing, we're looking at a very large, high-level scale. That's how we're already seeing it. The rural residential community designation is really encouraging 1 per 10 in all cases. It's encouraging that anyway in its policy. My suggestion to you would be to look at the community as a whole and really use some of these principles, apply some of these principles across the whole community. And find places where 2.5 acres makes sense. 2.5 acres lots make sense, But then also find the areas where, in such and such condition, you would allow a communal system or smaller lots. You're still going to end up, most likely, by doing that with a density across the whole community that meets our expectations, which would be that 1 per 10, or 4 per 40, whatever you want to call it. In that way, if the community proceeded in that way, the diversified rural really doesn't matter anymore, because you're planning the whole community equally, you're doing it all on equal footing, but you're choosing where you want things to be. So some areas might be perfectly acceptable for 2.5 acre lots because the land is high and dry. It's good for that. Other areas might need to think more carefully about preserving natural resources. I don't know if you have anything to add to that. Am I speaking out of turn? I don't know.
No, I think that's.
So
Does that
then,
make sense?
so you've got the policy guided, the guided policy of diversified rural. And underneath that, we can be creative in the
Yes.
land use and the zoning.
Correct.
So then I go back to our border situation, so that the Met Council has a policy of diversified rural and 4 per 40. But they can do whatever they want underneath that land use and zoning designation. If we can, they can.
Well, Mr. Mayor, I would suggest that you could do whatever you want. There are some of those, as I had mentioned, there are a lot of those principles that we're looking for. If you're starting to do really urban type of development here, and, the type of densities that you might see in Elk River, then we think, whoa, what's happening here? We're not providing you sewer, and that's not gonna be consistent with a rural landscape.
Suggestion on this property, though, was 1 acre,
Right.
and certainly the guarantee by the neighboring city was 2.5.
Well, and this is where we would want to be very careful about that, because while we know it is an area that is generally higher and drier than other portions of your community, it does have access, that the pattern of having all 2.5 acre lots is not something that is promoted by the council. You might have pockets within developments here and there, but we really do want you, whether it's you or Oak Grove or whoever it is, that where you have opportunities for development, of going right back to what we were talking about before, that those principles of managing the rural landscape sustainably.
Councilmember Rainville.
Mr. Mayor. So the question I have then is, back to something Councilmember Bettinger said earlier about the Morton Preserve. People that live there love that. They like that small community feeling. They like the septic. The people driving by it don't like to look at it.
If they put the protected 40 on the other side by the highway, it'd have been.
And I'm trying to get to that point, is that had there been more thought on that, how that was plotted out, it may not be as intrusive to people as when they drive by it. Allowing us to decide where that type of a system would work again in the city, is to me a better deal for the city, because as a property owner comes up and says, I have these 80 acres I want to develop, they're very secluded. You'd have one road in, no one would see what's going on in there because of the trees, the layout of the land. Everybody can benefit by the pond that's there. If we take and circle the pond with homes, that allows us to meet some of that when the land makes it appropriate. And I think that's, excuse me, that is a good thing to have. You know, we do have to plan for something for seniors down the road. In the last week and a half, I've talked to two families, two couples that are leaving now then because of the inability to, or the not wanting to maintain their home and their property, you know, the land. So it'd be an option of looking at something like this, that plan use development in, of some fashion, that maybe we could be a benefit to our seniors that could stay then in the city. But without having to say, I'm gonna have it here, 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 and here, allow us to use it,
Would it be
even when
fair to
comes up.
say what you're requesting is a collaborative effort?
Yes.
That we define what we would do under the understanding that 50 years down the road, something will be different than now then, maybe. But rather, you're not imposing a diversified rural classification on us, but you're saying keep that in mind and be collaborative in our land use plans and policies and zoning that we present as part of our comp plan.
Mr. Mayor, I think that's a fair assessment, yes.
And this-
Planner Stockman first.
Just want to clarify that Morton Farm Preserve is a PUD, approved as a PUD under our current ordinance. Now, keep in mind that that was specifically related to that oak forest within that development. Hence, that's why it's where it is. But also, the current PUD ordinance that we have would not apply anywhere else because there are no other county designated special, natural resources in Nowden. So, we would have to come up with a new process for this, which would make sense. But just wanted to clarify that. I love the idea of, like Mary said, we put the open space around these developments that maybe,
And it's true in that one, we didn't have a choice because everything around that oak savanna is water. And they really didn't have much choice but to put that road where they did. And so, but a guided plan could help with that, saying here's the concept.
right.
But I think one of the things that many of the residents out here are saying, they don't want the density to change. And that's one of the considerations we had previously with trying to preserve open space, was any density change in that preservation of the open space was what was unwelcome. They're not looking for people to be rushing out here. We're inviting people out, we've got the land, we think it's a wonderful place to live, but once you get out here, it's like, as long as I don't see your house when you build it.
Well, to have options, like, because some people do like to have neighbors fairly close and others don't. Just like some people want to fence their whole property and others are happy with just fencing an area for their dog.
Well, and I think that there needs to be some consideration, because we are seeing more and more people that, for various reasons, can't or don't want to maintain what they have. The kids are gone and they don't go upstairs anymore and they're tired of mowing, but they love the community, they want to stay here. There has to be that discussion as part of our comp plan. How do we do that without changing the character of the community we have right now abruptly? Councilmember Rainville.
Mr. Mayor, and, excuse me. And also, and it's up to the property owners to come to us. How can we work with them? It's an open process. Public is, excuse me, public has input on it. And again, it's the landowners have the right to do with their land what they can do under existing zoning. And, but to work with them, as the mayor said, in a collaborative manner, to bring what's best for that landowner, the neighbors and the residents.
Mr. Mayor, one thing that has never been mentioned all night is that this property we're probably discussing the most over there is probably some of the best land that's in the whole county. And Nowden possesses one of the finest pieces of natural agricultural land anything in the North Metro area. There's one other piece in Centerville, but it's very small. All the rest of this is pretty much natural. And you can make more money farming this land than you go down to Ramsey, and I'll guarantee you could starve to death. But up here, it's a lot of good soil, and it's just a natural for raising corn and beans. And last year, for example, there was many of us that had well over 200 bushels the acre corn. And I never heard nobody ever mention this tonight at all. But some of that should be brought up, because there is no land. You can go all the way to Columbia Heights up here, and all you've got is sand and rocks between. There is no good land like there is in Nowden. And that's some of the last big, large pieces that we possess.
Well, I think that's part of why we're having the discussion, is if you divide all that good farmland up into 2.5 acre lots, or even 5 acre lots, you lose that ability to have the kind of crops that you have
Yeah,
right now.
I mean, it's just natural right there, and you don't have to add a lot of water to it. Ramsey, you gotta irrigate just about all of it. Oak Grove has just that little stretch over there. It's natural. And, I've watched that for many, many years. And even up in this area, it's a natural for agricultural.
And that's now up for sale for commercial residential, right?
Yep, so, but you gotta think about all those things. Now, down in Brooklyn Park, when they were advanced a lot of that, they just went right on up in a straight line pretty much, and developed it as it needed it, rather than to go like we're doing, here, everywhere. Because
Yeah, those farms lasted a long time down there.
that's right, and everybody always complained up here, we're short on that money, we gotta sell that land, But if you invested money in the stock market, did anybody come and volunteer to help you on that?
Not
It's the
last
same
time.
deal. Any investment carries a risk. So, but there's something to be thought about on that, as far as that being a natural.
And Harold, that's why we have you on the commission. You keep us thinking. Planner Stockman?
Does anyone have any other questions for our guests?
I have
think they've
one,
been very helpful.
Mayor, I have one question.
Commissioner Ames?
And we were talking about sewer line. It still goes back when you came out here, what was it, 20 years ago, what it was?
It wasn't them.
Well, and I remember that meeting, it was a hectic meeting. But anyway, you still aren't telling us where you want us to protect for a sewage line in the future. If we knew that, we could work with you more. And we have no idea, because originally we thought coming from Ramsey up would be the best thing. You guys wanted Elk River, over along Elk River border, but then you finally compromised and gave us over on 47. If we had an idea where this is going, we could work with you, but we have no ideas.
So what I would offer,
And
Mr.
Let me address part of that, because what I heard said earlier tonight, Dale, was it's really incumbent on us to work with our neighboring communities. Oak Grove has no plans right now. St. Francis has a system they'd love us to be part of. Elk River, at some point, will be offering something potentially, but their system, their capacity isn't there. And Ramsey's capacity isn't there. So we need to work with their staff and look at the surrounding communities and say, what's possible in our lifetime and say, how do we want to guide our development, if we do, to take advantage of that? The Met Council has never said, here's what you will do. They're saying at some point, there's going to be pipe to your border. At that point, it's up to you what to do with it. It was always gonna be up to the city of Now then to, if we wanted to connect to that pipe, figure out how we wanted to do it. We just need to know where the pipe is gonna come in from first and how we would want to develop accordingly. But right now, nobody knows. Oak Grove thought they were getting their pipe from East Bethel, and that didn't happen. They got their northern portion of their city in the St. Francis system. We frankly don't know, but that's incumbent on us as a council, as a commission, to be alert to what's going on in neighboring communities and be collaborative with them as well. And if Ramsey's saying, we're coming up this portion of our city, and our pipe's gonna be too small to take in anything in Now then for the next 40 years, we know how to plan. If they say, we've got big pipes coming up, and they're gonna be on the edge of your community, on 5 or on 47 or wherever it's gonna be, we also know what we can and what the possibilities are. Then we decide if we want to do anything. Once it hits our border, it's still within Now then's prerogative, because we got to pay for it. It's now, it's up to Now then to consider that as we develop. And that's where the guiding of our plans say this is reasonable, and then you talk with the landowners and say, how do you want to develop? And so they're not going to tell us where the pipe's coming from, because right now it's not even in their 2040 plan. I don't think you're beyond Andover at this point. So, and that was part of what happened, part of the argument that Oak Grove used is since you weren't even beyond Andover in the 2040 plan, that was their out chip, if you will, as my understanding is, you couldn't argue that the pipe's coming while you're locking up the land. Just,
Right, that's a longer conversation, it's very late, but we do have a pipe to East Bethel's, from East Bethel plant to Oak Grove's border, and that was not what they wanted, apparently. So, but that's a different conversation.
yeah. But anyway, that is something that is not pending and is probably not going to directly impact our immediate plans. Long range, yes, but we don't know where that's coming from at this point. It'll be a while before that pipe would ever go across Oak Grove.
And Mr. Mayor, Commissioner Ames, I would offer too that because all of your surrounding communities, St. Francis, and Ramsey in particular, are updating their plans now and looking at the infrastructure plans, that now's a good time to have that conversation with them, just to see where they're going, and where they might be. I know that Ramsey has a draft plan and they're kind of back and forth on what they're doing with their sewer and still trying to figure that out. Certainly if there's an agreement amongst communities about what that might look like in the future, now's a good time to have that conversation. And I don't know what Elk River is doing, but it's always never a bad time to have a conversation with the neighboring community about what their infrastructure plans are.
And any other questions? We appreciate it's much longer than we anticipated, probably than you did too. Now you got to drive home in the dark. So hopefully you got to enjoy the view on the way out here. So.
And don't enjoy the deer on the way back?
Yes.
As long as you're not from your car. Don't worry, the bear got him.
Yeah. Yeah, watch out for the bears. That last scene just south of us here, so. Oh, and by the way, if you see the bear, you're supposed to call the DNR because they're trying to track their patterns. They're thinking that the males are coming down, but if they're seeing females and cubs, that's significant. So you don't have to give your address, just a general location. Call the DNR if you see the bears.
My deer's here.
Yeah. Well, they also say take down your bird feeder. All right, anything else for Lisa and Eric? All right, well, thank you for your time, and we will have robust debates from here on out, and you will be informed.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
So, So with that being longer than we thought, probably a little late to be opening up much new.
Can we,
You know, summarize where we go next here, what, or is there anything that you want to get our feedback on at this point?
probably the second most important thing next to this discussion is the expansion of the commercial industrial. So whether or not you want to just briefly touch on it for, 10, 20 minutes, just so I can get an idea, otherwise, we could go ahead and schedule another work session.
Mr. Mayor?
Councilmember Rainville.
I would move that it's 9:15. I think that the other topics on the agenda shouldn't be rushed through. So I move we adjourn to another date and time to continue the discussion.
All right. I'm going to second that motion.
Second.
A motion and a second. Any other discussion? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Sorry, Liz. But I agree, it probably is not a 10-minute discussion.
That's all we want.
Sorry. Lion,
Just right on the motion, right on, there you are.
Yeah,
Red.
yes, but I don't know for sure we have forms, so I would say put away.
I'm green now, so
Minutes and stuff like that or whatever. Of now,
so push it again?
farmer's market, like $900 or $1,200 a year, something like that for signs. No, it's no bullshit. Okay, well, if the city, if our tax dollars